What makes this moment so important isn't just the headline number attached to the decision, it's the message hidden inside it. An 8-1 ruling doesn't happen by accident. That kind of margin tells us something deeper is going on inside the court, something structural, something philosophical. When that many justices line up on one side, it signals a consensus that transcends party labels, political eras, and public expectations. And that consensus is this: constitutional rights, even the most sacred ones, are no longer being treated as fixed guardrails, but as flexible framework that can be adjusted when the court believes circumstances demand it. Now, on the surface, nothing dramatic appears to have been taken away. There was no declaration that free speech is canceled. There was no announcement that the right to bear arms no longer exists. In fact, that's exactly why this decision is so powerful and so dangerous at the same time. The shift didn't happen through an outright rejection of rights, but through a recalibration of their limits. The language sounds reasonable. It sounds balanced. It sounds like common sense. And that's precisely how lasting changes are usually introduced. What the ruling effectively does is redefine how far the government can go in regulating the exercise of constitutional freedoms. For decades, the standard was clear: rights could be regulated only under the most narrowly tailored circumstances, with the burden firmly on the state to justify any intrusion. This decision subtly flips that dynamic. It lowers the threshold. It gives lawmakers and regulators more room to argue that restrictions are not only acceptable, but necessary, as long as they are framed as addressing public safety, social stability, or modern conditions. And here's where the connection between the First and Second Amendments becomes critical. Traditionally, these rights were analyzed separately, each with its own history, its own tests, its own protections. This ruling blurs that separation. It treats them less as distinct freedoms and more as examples of a broader category: rights that must coexist with government interests. That may sound harmless, but once rights are grouped this way, restrictions applied to one can be used to justify restrictions on the other. Think about how speech has already been handled in recent years. We've grown accustomed to hearing that certain speech may be limited for the greater good, to prevent harm, to maintain order, to protect society. Now imagine that same logic becoming the default framework for evaluating other constitutional freedoms. Not eliminated, not revoked, just managed. Managed by standards that can evolve, expand, and quietly tighten over time. The most striking part of this ruling isn't what it says outright, but what it invites in the future. Lower courts will cite it. Legislators will lean on it. Agencies will interpret it in ways that push boundaries just a little further each time. And because the Supreme Court itself established this precedent with such an overwhelming majority, challenges will face an uphill battle. After all, if 8 justices agreed, who's left to argue that the line has already been crossed? This is how constitutional erosion actually happens. Not with chaos, but with calm. Not with shock, but with reassurance. Rights don't disappear overnight. They are reshaped through definitions, exceptions, and interpretations that feel minor in isolation, but massive in accumulation. Today, it's about how a right is exercised. Tomorrow, it's about when. And eventually, it becomes about who qualifies. And let's be honest, most people won't feel the impact immediately. Daily life goes on. Speech continues. Ownership continues. That's why moments like this don't trigger alarm bells for the majority. But history shows us that the most consequential shifts are often invisible at first. They show up years later when someone realizes that a freedom they assumed was untouchable now requires permission, justification, or compliance with rules that didn't exist before. An 8-1 decision also sends a psychological signal. It tells institutions and governments that the court is comfortable granting them broader discretion. It tells citizens that resistance may be futile because the highest legal authority has already spoken with near unity. That perception alone changes behavior. People self-censor, they self-limit, they adjust, not because they are forced to, but because they sense the boundaries moving. This ruling reframes the Constitution not as a shield that restrains power, but as a document that adapts to power. And while adaptation can sound wise, it carries a cost. The more flexible rights become, the more dependent they are on who happens to be in charge at any given moment. What feels like a reasonable restriction today can become a tool of control tomorrow, justified by precedent that was set quietly, deliberately, and with overwhelming judicial approval. So when we talk about this decision, we're not talking about a single case or a single outcome. We're talking about a turning point in how rights are understood in this country. A moment where the court signaled that constitutional freedoms are no longer absolute principles to be defended at all costs, but variables to be balanced against shifting societal priorities. That the real weight of this decision isn't locked in legal language or courtroom theory, it's in what happens next. Court rulings don't live in isolation. They travel. They get quoted, referenced, and repurposed in ways most people never see until the effects reach their ear. very day lives. And this one is already positioned to shape the future of both free expression and the right to self defense in ways that extend far beyond the case itself. What's changed is the standard. For a long time, the default question was whether the government had the authority to restrict a constitutional right at all. Now the question is becoming how much restriction is acceptable. That might sound like a subtle difference, but it flips the entire relationship between citizens and power. Instead of rights being presumed free, unless clearly abused, they are increasingly treated as privileges that must be exercised within boundaries defined by regulators, lawmakers, and courts. Once that mindset takes hold, it doesn't stop with one amendment. The reasoning used to justify limits on speech becomes transferable. The logic used to defend restrictions on firearms becomes adaptable. Courts and governments don't need to invent new arguments anymore. They just need to cite precedent. And this ruling gives them exactly that. A Supreme Court-approved framework that says rights can be constrained as long as the justification sounds reasonable and the intent is framed as protection. This is how the future gets shaped, not through dramatic crackdowns, but through normalization. Each new regulation is presented as modest, targeted, and necessary. Each one is defended as consistent with constitutional values, even as those values are being reinterpreted. Over time, people stop asking whether a restriction should exist and start arguing only about how strict it should be. That shift alone represents a massive loss of ground. The most concerning part is how. This ruling blurs the distinction between individual liberty and collective control. The Constitution was designed to protect the individual, especially when public opinion or political pressure swings in another direction. But when courts begin weighing rights primarily against government interests, the balance changes. The individual no longer stands at the center of the equation. Stability, order, and efficiency begin to carry equal or greater weight. And once that happens, enforcement expands. Agencies gain more discretion. Local governments experiment with broader rules. Federal authorities step in with guidelines that quickly turn into mandates. Each step is justified by pointing back to this moment, to this decision, to the idea that the highest court already approved the approach. Challenging these actions becomes harder. Not because they are clearly constitutional, but because the threshold for what counts as unconstitutional has been raised. Another long-term effect is cultural, not legal. When people believe their rights are conditional, behavior changes. Speech becomes cautious. Dissent becomes quieter. Ownership becomes something to justify, rather than something to assume. This isn't imposed by force, it happens organically. People adapt to the environment they're placed in, and an environment shaped by expanded government discretion produces compliance, long before resistance ever forms. This is why the case will echo for decades, not because it made headlines for a week, but because it will quietly shape thousands of future decisions at lower levels. Judges will rely on it to uphold restrictions. Lawmakers will reference it when drafting new laws. Regulators will point to it when challenged. And each time, the boundaries will inch inward, not dramatically, but steadily. What's especially striking is how this transcends partisan politics. No matter who holds power, the expanded authority remains. Tools created today don't disappear when leadership changes. They get inherited. And once a precedent exists that allows rights to be limited under broad, flexible standards, every future administration gains access to that power. The debate stops being about whether power should exist and becomes about who gets to use it. That's why this moment matters to everyone, regardless of ideology. Free speech doesn't belong to one side. Self-defense doesn't belong to one party. These are foundational protections meant to exist above political cycles. But when courts reframe them as negotiable, they become vulnerable to the shifting wind of culture, fear, and crisis. And history tells us exactly how that ends. Emergencies become permanent justification. Temporary measures turn into standard practice. What was once unthinkable becomes normal, then unquestioned, all the while the original purpose of the Constitution, to restrain power, slowly fades into the background. This ruling didn't take rights away today. It changed the rules that will determine whether they survive tomorrow. And that distinction is crucial, because once future cases rely on this decision, reversing course becomes exponentially harder. Courts respect precedent, governments defend it, and citizens are left arguing from a position that has already shifted beneath their feet. So when people ask why this matters, the answer is simple. Because the future of freedom isn't decided only by what is banned, but by what is allowed to be regulated. And this decision made regulation the new normal.